Recording. Yep, recording. That's not true. That's not true. Erev Tov. So just a reminder that everybody remembers Rav Shechter is going to be here tonight at 7 o'clock. So it gives you enough time to get home after Maariv, have a quick dinner, and then come back. So, but we'll see you all then. So later this week, as we know on Fridays, Asara B'Tevet, Rav Shechter will be speaking about it later. But if Fridays Asara B'Tevet, that means that tonight is Chet B'Tevet, the 8th of Tevet, the 9th of Tevet, the 10th of Tevet. It says, in fact, different things happen on each of these days. Really, we should have been fasting for 3 days. Thankfully, we don't fast for 3 days in a row. As I said, okay, we'll fast on Asara B'Tevet, and that will be enough for all 3 of them. Tet B'Tevet, 9th of Tevet, which is tomorrow night, is very interesting, very mysterious. We don't know exactly. The Shulchan Aruch actually says, in Siman Tav Kuf Pei, which is at the end of Hilchot Taniyot, Shulchan Aruch goes through all the dinim of a Tanit Tzibur, and then he has a whole siman where he lists different days on which it's customary to fast. Not the 4 obligatory fasts of the Churban, of Yud Zayin B'Tammuz, Tisha B'Av, right? That's something else. But there are a number of days throughout the year where there was a custom to fast on them. So he says, these are days on which different calamitous events occurred, and it's fitting to fast on them. Again, nowadays we don't really fast so much beyond the absolute minimum. But he says, for example, Bechad ben Nisan meitu bnei Aaron. The 1st of Nisan was the day that Aaron's sons died. When it goes on, yeah, that's Rosh Chodesh. That's the only one. Rosh Chodesh Nisan. That's a discussion there. That's the only one. Again, nowadays not really so common, but that's the exception. B'chaf bo met Yoshua ben Nun, on the day which Yoshua died. Basar b'Iyar met Eli Kohen u'shnei banav v'nishba'al on Hashem. On the 10th of Iyar, that's the day when Eli Kohen and his sons died, and the Aaron was taken captive. Kafchet bo met Shmuel hanavi, etc. And then, so we'll just skip to Tevet, which is where we are now, right? And it says, B'shmone b'Tevet nichtavat Torah Yevanit b'mei Talmai HaMelech. Okay, we'll come back to Shmone Tevet in just a moment. Just wanted to say, U'b'tish'a bo lo noda ezo hi hatzara shel Rabo. On the 9th of Tevet, this is a day in which we should fast. We don't know what the tzara was. Okay, the Mishnah Berurah points out, he says, we do know. He says, B'shlichot shelanu ita shemet Ezra Sofer. That is the day that Ezra died. Okay, there are other theories and other ideas and other speculations as well as to what happened on the 9th of Tevet. You think about the time of year we're in, and you can maybe put it together, but we will leave that for another time. But on the 8th of Tevet, so it says, Shmona b'Tevet nichtava Torah Yevanit. The Torah was written in Greek. B'mei Talmai HaMelech, in the days of Talmai the king. V'aya choshech ba'olam shlosha yamim. The Shulchan Aruch, quoting Chazal, right? There was darkness descended to the world for 3 days because the Torah was translated into Greek. Okay, very, very, very fascinating. The Gemara in Megillah tells us a little bit more about this event, about this translation, what's known as the Targum HaShiv'im, translation of 70, actually 72, or the Septuagint is known in Greek, or Latin. And the Gemara tells us the story as follows. It says, Tanya, Maseh, Talmai HaMelech shekineh 72 zkenim. Right, so Talmai the king got 72 of the sages together. He put them into 72 different rooms. Each one was locked away in a room by himself. And you didn't tell them what they were there for. You get taken in for an interrogation, you don't know what it is, etc. And then he went to them. He went to each of these 72 sages and he told them, write for me the Torah, write your Torah in Greek. This was the first time the Torah is being translated in its entirety. And then the Gemara says, what happened next was miraculous. It says, Natan HaKadosh Baruch Hu belev kol echad ve'echad eitzah. Hashem planted wisdom in the hearts of each and every one of them. V'skimu kulan lede'ah achat. And they all agreed, they all did the same thing. In other words, when they wrote the translation, nowadays we just ask artificial intelligence to do it for you. But in those days, each one did the translation. They changed things. They changed things from the way they were written originally in the Torah. And the fact is, whenever you translate a text, right, a text is written in a certain language. all the more so. This is true for Lashon HaKodesh and for the Torah Kedosha. So there are certain things which cannot be translated, certain ideas and nuances and concepts, etc. And one of the things they were afraid of is that if they were going to translate directly, translate literally, then things would have been distorted or worse. So they made changes. They didn't just translate, but they edited it as well. And the miracle that was done was that none of them could speak to one another. 72 sages sitting in 72 different rooms. Each one changed and made a number of changes to the text, and they all translated it the exact same way. Of course, everybody knows that it's a minor miracle. It would have been a much greater miracle if they'd all been in the same room and they'd made the same changes, right? But your laugh reveals more than you think. Okay, so that's but that's what the Gemara says, and it gives us examples of what was changed. So, for example, it says Katvu lo Elokim bara Bereshit. When they translated, they didn't write Bereshit bara Elokim. They said Elokim bara Bereshit. You know, that it shouldn't sound like somebody else created God. Chas v'chalila, right? It says they translated, and they wrote E'eseh Adam b'tzelem u'v'dmut. I will make man, as opposed to Na'aseh Adam, right? So they wouldn't think, oh, there's more than one God, etc. For example, that was one of the changes they wrote in the singular as opposed to in the plural. Very interesting. It says, the Gemara continues, this is in the Gemara Megillah Daf Tet. One of the things it says with a list of animals, of kosher and non-kosher species, so it says Ve'etar nevet. So they changed that. וכתבו לו את שעירת הרגליים, לא כתבו לו את הארנבת. Why? מפני שאשתו של תמי ארנבת שמה. That was the name of the king's wife. So they didn't want her to be offended and think, oh, they're making fun of me, etc. So they changed it. So okay, so those are all the different. So those are some of the changes they made. So what's interesting about the story, as we've seen, they were forced to translate the Torah into Greek. This is problematic. We have a very negative reaction to this whole incident. Shulchan Aruch told us, according to Chazal, that as a result of this, darkness came to the world for 3 days. Okay, this is a terrible event. We have to fast as a result. It's got to fast on the day when this happened. So, in other words, we seem to understand the translation is inherently a negative thing, that it shouldn't have been done. We would have been far better off without it, that Chazal didn't want it. Yet, on the other hand, we have other sources in Chazal, and no less than in the Torah itself, that seem to have a very positive attitude towards translation, not like this. So, for example, towards the end of Sefer Dvarim, we read the following. In Parashat Ki Tavo, it says, "Vayabav lachem et hayaden, takimu et havanim ha'ele, asher anochi matzaveh etchem hayom b'har Evad, v'sata otam b'sid." Right, Moshe Rabbeinu is told that when we're going to cross over the Yarden, we're going to come into Eretz Yisrael, and you're going to put up stones. And it says, "V'katavta al havanim et kol divrei haTorah azot be'er hetev." You'll write all the words of the Torah be'er hetev. What does be'er hetev mean? Rashi says be'er hetev means in Shivim Lashon. There are 70 languages. You have to translate it. You have to explain it so everybody can understand it. Rashi didn't make it up. He's quoting from Masechet Sotah. Masechet Sotah tells us, says, "Achar kach heviu et havanim, banu et hamizbech, v'sadu b'sid, v'katvu alav et kol divrei haTorah, v'shiv'im lashon, shne'amar be'er hetev." So from the Torah itself, it is be'er hetev. We want people to understand. We want people to realize what is written. So we translate into the 70 languages. So on the one hand, you have this incident with Tamai HaMelech, where we see it's inherently a negative thing to translate. On the other hand, already preceding that, the Torah itself says, be'er hetev. You want everybody to understand. Translate the Torah. Go ahead. Do it not just into one language, into 70. So what is it? Are we for translation? Are we against translation? Should we be giving this whole share in Hebrew? Right? How do we resolve these two things? So if you look at, and the truth is there's more. The Gemara talks about Targum in a number of places. Pesach Megillah, we have Targum Onkelos, we have Targum Yonatan, different translations for different parts of Tanakh. Shnai Mikra v'echad Targum, right? There's an obligation we have every week. So essentially what I would say is, and there's different ways to approach this, but I think that there are two main factors to understand, to help us resolve the contradiction and understand what exactly is the problem. Right? The first thing that it seems that Chazal were concerned about when it comes to translation is that obviously we're worried that there's going to be a distortion. you're worried there's going to be a distortion of what's written in the Torah. It's not going to be understood properly. It's going to be mistranslated, perhaps, right? And that is a problem. And once we have this incident where the entire Torah is translated and the Chachamim are forced to do so, right? From there on, it's a slippery slope. It's translated into one language, and maybe what happens if it's translated, and this is what did happen, we know. They translate into Greek, and subsequently other people are going to come and other generations, and they're going to translate, not from the original, but they translate from the translation. When you translate from the translation, from the translation, from the translation, from the translation, you get all sorts of distortions, and you get all sorts of things which are misunderstood. Chazal purposely mistranslated in order that it wouldn't be distorted. But somebody who's coming afterwards, somebody who doesn't know that, somebody who's learning just from the second-hand sources, thinks that that's what was written in the original. They misunderstand. So we're worried distortion. Obviously, if the one who is translating is not reliable and is not expert, then we're going to get all sorts of distortions throughout the ages. And Rav Moshe Feinstein has a very interesting tshuva about this. He's asked. This is in Igrot Moshe. This is in Yerodei Chelek Dalet Siman Lamed Chet. So he's asked if one is allowed to translate Kitvei HaKodesh, Rashi, he quotes Rashi that we mentioned, etc. Can you translate Tanakh? Can you translate Mishnayot, etc.? So he says, לעניין הלכה, אם משה נתרגם תנ"ך, שהם דברים שבכתב, הנה תורה שבכתב, החזינן דאיקה לתורה שבכתב כמה תרגומים. So we know that there are a number of, again, before Targum HaShivim, there are a number of translations to the Torah. We have Targum Onkelos, we have Targum Yonatan, etc. That he says regarding Torah Shebichtav. And when it comes to Torah Sheba'al Peh, he says, Gam Mishnayot V'Halachot, Leika Isur Miletargem. He says there is no prohibition to translate them. אבל העיקר שהמתרגם צריך לדע אחריות המתרגם. The one who is translating, I think it seems to be the question I was asked, but somebody who, if he's allowed to work for ArtScroll, for L'tzorach ha'inyan, if he's allowed to go and translate these things. And he says, you have to understand there's a very, very heavy responsibility. You can do it, but it has to be done properly. שבטעות קטן, שייך להכשיר בטעות את הלומדים מהעתקה על שפה אחרת. You're going to make a small translation, a small mistranslation, a small nuance, then that's going to lead to grave errors in understanding. He says, עיין בהקדמות המעתיקים פירוש המשנות של הרמב"ם, איך שהראו מלהעתיק פירושו שנכתב בערבית ללשון הקודש הנחוץ מאוד. He says, if you look at the Rambam, the Mishneh Torah, right, the Yad HaChazakah, the Rambam wrote in Hebrew, but everything else he wrote in Arabic. And he said, Perusha Mishnayot, for example, which was originally written by the Rambam in Arabic, that was the spoken language. Those who translated are very, very cautious and are very wary about the responsibility they have for translating this. So he says, Kol sheken, שיש למתרגמים מעברית לשפת אנגלית, שיש לחוש לטעותם, שבשביל זה יש להם נועה מזה. He says the same thing, a person has to be very, very careful. If we're going to translate from Hebrew to English, we're not going to, we have to get it right. He says, אם אחד יודע בנפשו, וכן מחזיקין חבריו אותו לבקיא גדול בשפת האנגלית ותלמיד חכם שבכיתוב המשניות שרוצה להעתיק אין איסור. Okay, he says if a person knows that they know the language well, they know they're experts in the material, then they can translate. But he says יותר ראוי שילמדו רוצים ללמוד בראשונת שפת הגמרא שזה יהיה ביתר הצלחה. He says it's better learn the language, learn it in the original, than rather than learning in translations and secondhand. Okay. And then he says, it's interesting, he says, so when it comes to, that's in terms of translating Torah and translating Mishnayot, he says, what about translating halakha? Writing, Shulchan Aruch, Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, other Sifrei Kitzurim, etc., translating that and writing in English. So he says, נראה כדברים שזה רב משה פיינשטיין. He says, נראה כדברים שצריך כל אחד לידע, שלא שייך לשאול על זה. He says, there are certain things, certain halachot, everybody has to know, and you won't be able to ask a shayla if it comes up. He says, for example, הלכות קריאת שמע ותפילה. שאם נזדמן לו איזה ספק, אינו יכול לשאול באמצע התפילה, זה לא ישיבוהו. A person has some sort of question, and הלכות קריאת שמע, הלכות תפילה, in the middle of תפילה, you can't go and ask, you have to know. So he says, those things like that, יש לתרגם שיוכלו ללמוד אנשים שאין מבינים בלשון הקודש. Therefore, you can't go and ask. So somebody who's not an expert and is not going to be able to learn the פסקי הלכה, he says you have to translate it for them. לדברים האלו סגי לכתוב ולא תמים מקורות, he says that's enough. You can translate, you can write the bottom line, you don't have to write all the explanation. יש גם דווקא להקפיד שיכתבו בלא טעם, אם יכתבו טעם ולא יבין איש הפשוט, לא יעשה כפי הדין אלא לפי דעתו. Okay, very interesting svara. He says maybe it's better to translate without the explanations, because you're going to write the explanation, and somebody who's reading the translation, person reading the translation is the person who can't learn the original, doesn't know, so they'll read the translation, they'll read the explanation, and then they'll come up with their own svarot, and they won't do what follows. Okay, but bottom line is, what we see from here is that when it comes to, it's not necessarily that the translation itself is inherently bad, but the fact is that translation makes it somebody's learning from a second-hand source. You're not learning from the primary source. There's going to be distortions, there's going to be misunderstandings, and that is what we are very, very concerned about. If it's done in a reliable, authoritative way, so that may not be as much of a problem. There is a second issue that comes up, which the poskim talk about here regarding translation, but we are out of time. Rabbi Hanania ben Akasha Omer, HaKadosh Baruch Hu lezakot et Yisrael,